There was a time when Ava Morgan believed that being needed was the same as being loved. In the glittering Morgan household, where perception was currency and perfection the family creed, Ava was the soft-spoken, steady thread stitching chaos into calm. While her siblings chased headlines and their parents preserved appearances, Ava held the fractures together in silence, fetching forgotten medications for their mother, covering up Damien's early financial mistakes, and sitting quietly beside her father at corporate events when his ego needed applause without competition. But even ghosts have breaking points. The unraveling began in winter. A car accident, a hospital room, a loss too personal to name aloud. Ava had called her family from the emergency room with trembling fingers and tear-choked breath. No one came. Not that night, not the next, not even a text from Tessa, who was too busy parading down a red carpet with a borrowed designer clutch and a new fiancé she barely knew. Damien, the golden heir, sent a bouquet. His assistant did, rather. Their mother left a voicemail filled with thinly veiled discomfort and quickly pivoted to details about an upcoming charity brunch. And Victor Morgan, patriarch, empire builder, and self-anointed god of legacy, showed up days later, wearing a tailored coat and a frown that reeked of disappointment. "You can't fall apart like this," he told her as she sat in a wheelchair, still pale from blood loss. "You're not built for pain, Ava. You're not strong enough for this family." The words didn't land like a slap. They settled cold, like frostbite, slow and numbing until she couldn't feel anything at all. That was the moment Ava realized she wasn't a daughter in the Morgan dynasty. She was insulation, useful, replaceable, forgettable. Within a week, she was gone. No confrontation, no accusations, just an empty bedroom and a neatly folded note left on the mahogany dresser. "Take care of each other. You always have." They didn't chase her. There was no search party, no tearful family meeting. Instead, her name was quietly deleted from the group chat. Tessa edited her out of recent Instagram photos with a filter that turned Ava into background blur. At the next family dinner, a new seating chart was drawn. Her chair wasn't empty, it was gone. At first, Ava thought it would hurt more. She imagined herself unraveling in isolation, sobbing in cheap motels or whispering into payphones like a woman from an old noir film. But it wasn't like that. Instead, the silence was clean, peaceful, and in that stillness, Ava began to notice something she'd never allowed herself to see before. She had never truly belonged to them. Her absence wasn't a wound, it was a relief to them. But it was also a mistake. They assumed she'd stay silent. They assumed she'd vanish and stay vanished, tucked neatly behind the golden curtain of their curated lives. They didn't realize that while they were busy being loud and beautiful and ruthless, Ava had been watching, learning, memorizing every secret, every lie whispered behind closed doors, every cruel joke made at her expense. She'd carried their burdens, but she had also cataloged them. Not out of malice, not at first. But when love dries up and loyalty curdles, what's left behind is clarity. Ava became a ghost, but not the kind that fades, the kind that waits. And so, while the Morgans toasted milestones and papered over sins with magazine spreads and PR distractions, Ava was somewhere else, quietly planning, writing, remembering. Because ghosts don't haunt strangers, they haunt the people who made them invisible in the first place. The Morgan estate gleamed under the floodlights like a cathedral of wealth. Manicured hedges lined the driveway in sculpted spirals, and champagne flutes clinked beneath the canopy of gold chandeliers. Waiters in black bowdies moved like shadows through the crowd, offering delicate canapés no one touched and smiles that never reached their eyes. Victor Morgan's retirement gala was not just a celebration, it was a coronation. 40 years of empire building distilled into a single, glittering evening. The ballroom overflowed with legacy. Senators, CEOs, media darlings, and enough heirs to bankrupt a small country. Everyone who mattered was there. Everyone except Ava. No one spoke of her absence. Her name had become a ghost syllable in the Morgan household, exorcised from memory through strategic silence and careful redirection. Tessa sparkled in a beaded ivory gown, her newest diamond barely catching the light before she repositioned her wrist to flash it. She clung to her fiancé, Nolan, an investment heir with a trust fund and a wandering eye, as if to remind herself she still belonged in this world of glossy power. Her laugh rang a little too loud, her smile strained just a little too wide. Damien, already drunk before the second course, held court near the cigar bar, regaling a circle of Wall Street vultures with stories that walked the razor edge between bravado and confession. His wife Clarissa kept her distance, nursing her second glass of wine and a growing suspicion she couldn't quite name. Their mother, Ava Morgan, floated from table to table like a swan gliding over black water, effortless, elegant, and utterly controlled. But there was a twitch at the corner of her mouth that hadn't been there before, a tiny crack in the porcelain. Victor himself stood atop the staircase, looking down at the world he had shaped with his bare hands. There were no heirs in his eyes, only successors, pieces to be positioned, assets to be leveraged. He smiled as he watched the crowd swirl beneath him. The kingdom was intact, the legacy preserved. And then the envelopes arrived. Not with drama, not with fanfare. Just a quiet ripple, like the first cold breeze before a storm. One by one, sleek black envelopes were hand-delivered by a courier in a dark suit. No logos, no explanation. Just a nod. The guests paid little attention. Another PR stunt? A designer invitation? But the family knew better. Each envelope was addressed in looping, deliberate handwriting. To Damien, to Tessa, to Eleanor, to Victor. Each signed at the bottom with a name they had worked so hard to forget. Ava. Tessa's fingers trembled as she held the envelope, the paper heavier than it should have been. Damien stared at his as though it might detonate. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but her expression remained frozen. Only Victor showed no reaction. He tucked the envelope beneath his arm and continued his descent down the staircase, a king unwilling to flinch in front of his court. They didn't open them right away. Not in front of the crowd. Not in the full light of scrutiny. But the mood shifted. Something unspoken passed between the siblings. A sharp glance. A breath held too long. The gala continued. Music played, toasts were made, but the glitter dulled, the wine soured. In a far corner of the ballroom, Clarissa noticed her husband's hand shaking as he slid the envelope into his jacket. Nolan whispered something to Tessa, and her face turned the color of ash. Eleanor disappeared into the powder room for 22 minutes. When she returned, her eyes were dry, but her lipstick was gone. The night trudged on beneath the weight of unspoken questions. Who had sent them? What was inside? Why now? Only Victor seemed immune. He smiled for the cameras, shook hands with senators, and gave a toast that earned polite applause. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, kept flickering back to the envelope still tucked under his arm. He hadn't opened it yet, not because he wasn't curious, because he was afraid to. By midnight, the guests began to leave. Tessa's laugh had vanished. Damien was nowhere to be found. Eleanor offered excuses for her children's fatigue with a brittle smile. And Victor, ever the showman, stood beneath the grand chandelier, still smiling, still holding the envelope. Outside, the courier vanished into the night. And somewhere, far from the gala and the golden lights, Ava Morgan watched the world she once called home begin to tremble. They read them in silence. Not together, not aloud, alone. In the aftermath of the gala's shimmering collapse, the Morgans slipped away like shadows retreating from the sunrise, clutching their envelopes as though they were bombs with no timers, unsure when or if they would explode. Damien Morgan locked himself in his study first. His hands trembled as he unfolded the thick paper, the kind you'd expect a wedding invitation to be printed on. But this was no celebration. "Hello, big brother," the letter began, written in Ava's unmistakable hand. Fluid, confident, patient. A ghost's voice resurrected. "You always thought I wasn't watching, But I was. I saw the second set of books you kept tucked in your briefcase. The offshore account. The false charitable donations you laundered through the Morgan Foundation. I even saw the not-so-accidental fire at the Lakehurst office. You weren't clever. You were just arrogant. Damien's breath caught. The words slashed through him, each one too specific to be guesswork. She knew. She'd been watching long before she vanished, watching even while he was laughing at her behind her back. He turned the page with a shaking hand. You wore the crown so well that no one asked where it came from, but I know how you got it. And now, so does this letter. All it takes is one copy to the board. To the press. To your wife. Ask yourself, how many people would protect a thief when the spotlight hits? At the bottom, in slanted script, you never noticed me, but I saw everything. Damien slumped into his leather chair, the color draining from his face. He didn't even realize he was sweating until the letter curled in his damp fingers. Across the estate, in the soft pink glow of her ensuite vanity, Tessa read hers curled on the edge of her chaise lounge. She unsealed the envelope with a delicate letter opener shaped like a swan. The absurd elegance of it struck her now. How blind she'd been. Dearest Tessa, Ava had written. I never envied your talent, only how much you believed your own myth. Tessa frowned, but continued. The miracle scholarship you flaunted to Stanford? You never earned it. You didn't know that, did you? Father pulled strings, paid off the committee chair, and scrubbed your failing grades. You thought you were chosen because of your audition. You weren't. You were paid for. Tessa blinked hard. That couldn't be true. She remembered the applause. She remembered the tears in the dean's eyes after her monologue. Didn't she? Even your fiancé doesn't know. Yet. But he will. Soon. And when he learns that your resume is a lie, that your image was always a construct, what will he still see in you, Tessa? Beauty? It fades. Legacy? It's crumbling. A single sentence underlined at the end. I didn't steal your spotlight. I just turned it around. Tessa stood so quickly she knocked over her perfume tray. Bottles crashed to the marble floor, glass splintering across her designer rug. She didn't notice. She was already dialing Nolan. He didn't answer. Eleanor Morgan sat in her solarium, glass of wine untouched. The envelope rested on her lap like a dead bird. She didn't need to open it. She already knew what it would say. Ava had known for years about her affair with a man barely older than Damien, someone Eleanor had met during a spa retreat in Palm Springs. She had confided in Ava during one of her melancholy spells, back when she still thought of Ava as her emotional sponge, not a threat. She thought Ava would forget, or at least remain silent. But Ava hadn't forgotten, and now the silence had become its own language. The absence of her letter said more than any written confession could. Ava had chosen not to write to her. She had left Eleanor out, not out of mercy, but as a warning. Even the discarded aren't worth the ink. By morning, the family group thread was eerily silent. No witty memes, no calls for brunch, no passive-aggressive check-ins. It was as if the whole network had flatlined. Victor noticed he hadn't opened his letter yet, not because he feared its contents. He feared nothing, but because he was waiting. He knew Ava. He knew how she thought. If this was her first move, the next would be worse. And worse still, she had played the first hand perfectly. He reached for his envelope finally, tore it open with a practiced hand. Read it once, then again. His face remained expressionless, except for a single twitch at the corner of his mouth. He folded the letter slowly, carefully. Then, he placed it into the fire. But Ava had already lit the match. By sunrise, the Morgan estate no longer felt like a monument. It felt like a mausoleum. The silence that followed Ava's letters was not peaceful. It was thick, pressurized. The kind of silence that comes before a building collapses, not from an explosion, but from decay deep in the foundation, and the foundation had started to rot. Damien hadn't slept. He stood at the kitchen island, staring down at a blank mug of coffee like it might hold answers. His tie was askew, hair unkempt, the pristine sheen of his usual perfection traded for a quiet unraveling. Tessa entered barefoot, in silk pajamas and a trembling lower lip. She didn't speak to him. Not at first, not until she noticed the envelope still sitting half unread on the counter beside him. "You didn't burn yours?" she asked, voice flat. Damien didn't look up. "She knows everything." Tessa hugged her arms. "Not everything. She got things wrong. She has to be wrong." Damien gave her a sideways glance, hollow and humorless. "About what? The scholarship your boyfriend didn't know was paid for? Or the account I used to siphon a few $100,000 from Dad's charities?" She opened her mouth, then shut it. It was the first time she'd heard Damien admit it. No denial. No deflection. No big brother grin to soften the blow. "She's going to destroy us," Tessa whispered. He turned to her slowly. "No, we're going to destroy ourselves. She's just giving us the rope." That was the moment the alliances began to crumble. Ava didn't need to scream to be heard. Her voice now lived in their thoughts, in their fears, and, most destructively, in their doubts about each other. By mid-morning, Ava Morgan had gathered them in the sunroom. The windows stretched wide enough to overlook the city skyline, but no one noticed the view. Tessa paced, Damien slouched. Eleanor stood, poised like a conductor trying to keep an orchestra from collapsing into chaos. "We don't panic," she said, her voice clipped and cold. "Ava's trying to provoke us into chaos. We don't give her that satisfaction." "She already has it," Damien snapped. "You read your letter?" Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the fireplace. "There was no letter." That silenced them both. "What do you mean?" Tessa asked. "I never got one," Eleanor lied. She didn't explain the envelope that had vanished from her purse. She didn't mention the moment she'd found it missing, how she'd torn through her things in the powder room, certain she'd dropped it, only to realize it had simply disappeared. Perhaps taken. Perhaps never sent. And that terrified her more than anything. Ava had made Eleanor irrelevant, unworthy of direct reckoning. Or worse, she had plans that required silence. Victor entered last. No announcement. Just the quiet hush of authority walking into the room. His expression was unreadable. His presence tightened the air. He glanced at each of them in turn. "This ends now," Tessa snorted. "She's already started it." "We handle it internally," Victor said. "No press, no board members, no public mistakes. Whatever she's doing, we crush it. Quietly." "And how do you propose we do that?" Damien asked. "She's gone. We don't even know where she is, or who else she's contacted." Victor's stare was hard enough to freeze blood. "We find her." "But you read her letter?" Tessa said slowly. "She said she's been watching us. For years. She has everything." Victor stepped closer. "She made one mistake." "And what's that?" "She underestimated how dangerous we become when cornered." He walked out without waiting for agreement. The siblings looked at each other. But something had shifted. Damien's eyes lingered on Tessa too long. Tessa crossed her arms, defensive. Eleanor said nothing. Ava hadn't just revealed secrets, she'd eroded trust. Every silence felt like a betrayal now. Every glance a potential threat. In the absence of unity, suspicion bred like rot beneath wallpaper. Later that day, Eleanor would search her room again, desperate for the missing letter. Tessa would call Nolan, only for it to go straight to voicemail for the second day in a row. And Damien, in a moment of private panic, would call a financial advisor to ask a question he never imagined asking: how fast can we make money disappear? Meanwhile, somewhere far away, Ava watched. Not from a distance, but from behind the curtain of their lives, waiting for the next tremor. She knew it was coming. Because they had just stepped onto the fault line. Just when they thought the storm had passed, another wave hit. It began 3 days after the gala, quietly, almost elegantly. Victor Morgan's trusted business partner, Gerald Kane, returned from a brief trip to London to find a hand-delivered manila envelope on his mahogany desk at the firm. No name, no return address, just a single word typed on the label, review. Inside, copies of emails, expense reports, offshore transfer logs, all implicating Damian Morgan in a years-long embezzlement scheme. At the top of the stack was a note, typed but signed in looping feminine script. When loyalty is blind, it becomes complicit. A.M. Gerald's face went white. He didn't speak. He just pressed the intercom and summoned his assistant to cancel the next week's meetings. The next envelope arrived that afternoon, at the high-rise apartment of Tessa's fiancé, Nolan Grant. He wasn't expecting it. He had just come from a strategy meeting with investors, eager to unwind. But the moment he opened it, everything unraveled. There, in black and white, were scans of emails between Tessa and her mother, discussing the exact amount of money paid to secure her Stanford admission. There were even screenshots from a deleted family group thread, boasting of the win, and then, a photograph. Ava, standing at the edge of the Stanford campus the day of Tessa's audition, nearly invisible behind a hedge, holding a notebook. Below it, typed in all caps, "True talent doesn't need to be bought." Nolan didn't sleep that night. By morning, he'd sent Tessa a message that read only, "We need to talk. In person. Alone." Tessa never responded. She didn't know how to. But that wasn't the final letter. The third arrived at the home of Damian's wife, Clarissa, just before Sunday brunch. She'd always considered Ava strange. Fragile, a little too observant, but harmless. Until now, Clarissa's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages Ava had collected. Bank statements, side payments, photos of Damian with a woman Clarissa didn't recognize, at a resort in Turks and Caicos from the year Clarissa had suffered her miscarriage. There was a note clipped to the top. "He lies as easily as he breathes. You deserved better." Clarissa didn't say a word. She calmly got dressed, packed a single weekend bag, and left a note of her own on the kitchen counter. She didn't call him. She didn't have to. By Monday morning, the Morgans were under siege, and Ava hadn't made a single public move. The damage was entirely private, intimate, tailored. She hadn't just aimed at their reputations. She had aimed at their relationships, the ones that made them feel untouchable, the ones they clung to when everything else faltered. And now, those ties were unraveling, one by one. Eleanor, noticing the growing silence, tried to intervene. She invited the family to dinner. "A truce," she said. "We're still a family," she said. No one showed up. She sat alone at the long, lacquered table, a glass of vintage Bordeaux untouched beside her roasted duck. And then, her phone buzzed. It was a message. Unknown number, just a single photo. Victor, her husband, at a luxury suite, holding hands with a woman young enough to be their daughter. No context, no threat, just truth. The past, documented. Eleanor stared at it. 1,000 feelings warred in her face. But it was the look of recognition that lingered longest. Ava knew what to show. She knew how to show it. Not a spectacle, not a scandal, a mirror. And she was making them look at it, one by one. Victor found out last. The next board meeting was supposed to be a formality, a celebration of his retirement and transition into a ceremonial chairmanship. Instead, 3 board members arrived late, tight-lipped and cautious. Gerald Kane refused to shake his hand, and one woman, Savita Ung, the youngest and most ruthless among them, pulled him aside. "I'm going to be blunt," she said. "We've received materials, allegations. There's going to be a review." Victor's jaw tightened. "Based on what? Your son, your books, your legacy, and someone's been watching you, closely." Victor didn't respond, but that night, he made a call. "Find her," he said into the phone, voice low and deadly. "I don't care what it costs." But by then, Ava was already gone again, not hiding, just waiting, watching her family ignite from the kindling they'd left behind. She hadn't lit the fire, they did. She just handed them the matches. The private investigator Victor hired came recommended by men who never asked twice and never left a trail. His name was Colm Bishop, a man who specialized in uncovering things that didn't want to be found. He didn't speak much, didn't dress like a PI from television, no trench coat, no fedora. Just clean lines, quiet steps, and eyes like wet glass. Reflective, unreadable. The kind of man who noticed everything and volunteered nothing. "She's not hiding," Colm told Victor during their first meeting in the cigar lounge of the Morgan penthouse. "She's removed herself. There's a difference." Victor bristled. "I don't care what you call it. Find her. I want to know where she's been, who she's spoken to, and what the hell else she's planning." Colm simply nodded, his fingers already moving over the worn surface of a small leather notebook. 3 days later, he called Victor with his first find. "She rented a storage unit on the edge of the city," Colm said, "under the name A. Monroe. Long-term lease, paid in cash. The key code hasn't been used in over a month." Victor met him there personally. The building was sterile and unremarkable. Fluorescent lighting, metal doors, the faint tang of dust and forgotten things. Unit 143. Colm unlocked it, then stepped back. Victor entered alone. The moment the door rolled up, he froze. It was not what he expected. There were no suitcases, no clothes, no cash or passports. Instead, walls of memories. Photos, hundreds of them, carefully pinned and labeled. Damien on a yacht, smiling too hard beside a man later convicted of securities fraud. Tessa at a cocktail party, mid-whisper with a senator's aide. Eleanor in a powder room mirror, fixing her lipstick while another woman cried behind her in the reflection. One entire wall was devoted to Victor himself. Business lunches, overheard recordings, ledgers from decades ago, and headlines that hadn't been published yet. In the center of the room stood a table. On it, a row of journals, identical in size and binding, marked only by date ranges. Victor opened one. The handwriting was unmistakable. Ava's, March 2017. "They told me not to ask questions at the family meeting, but I saw the numbers on Damien's laptop. I wrote them down. Just in case." April 2018. "Mom's crying again. She says Dad's not discreet anymore. I asked her if she wanted tea. She said I should learn not to be so available." July 2020. "Tessa's new fiancé is charming. I wonder if he knows she's still messaging her ex. I won't say anything, but I've saved the screenshots." Victor dropped the journal as if it burned. Ava hadn't been absent. She hadn't been silent. She'd been watching, recording, archiving every slight, every betrayal, every lie. She hadn't disappeared in grief. She'd simply gone underground. There was a television monitor on the back wall, its screen dark but recently used. Colm, stepping inside now, handed Victor a flash drive. "It was in a locked drawer," he said, labeled, "In case of emergency, thought you'd want to see it first." Victor inserted the drive into the small wall monitor. The screen flickered to life. It was a security-style recording, black and white, time-stamped. Ava, sitting at the very table he now stood beside, older, sharper. Her hair pulled back, a simple sweater. She looked directly into the camera. "If you're watching this, it means you've finally gone looking. That's good. You always did need a trail of blood to start caring." She smiled. "It wasn't cruel. It was tired, unshaken, inevitable. I didn't collect this because I wanted revenge. I collected it because, one day, I knew I'd stop loving you enough to protect you." She leaned forward, folding her hands. "I didn't disappear, you just stopped seeing me." Then the video ended. No drama, No theatrics, just silence. Victor stood there long after the screen went black. It wasn't just that Ava had planned this, it was how deeply she had embedded herself into the machinery of their lives. And now, by stepping away, by pulling herself out, everything was misfiring. The silence she left in her wake wasn't absence. It was accountability. Calm broke the quiet. "What do you want to do now?" Victor didn't answer. He only turned, walked out, and muttered under his breath. She was never the weak one. It began with whispers, memories long discarded, suddenly resurfacing with sharp new edges. Tessa sat curled on the velvet chaise in her childhood bedroom, the one she used to call the princess suite. Her phone buzzed constantly now, Nolan still demanding explanations, media outlets sniffing around the edges of the scholarship scandal, her mother texting in clipped, brittle sentences. But all Tessa could think about was one night in her senior year of high school. She had come home drunk from a graduation party, mascara streaked down her face, stumbling as she tried to sneak up the stairs. Eleanor had been out of town, Victor unreachable as usual. But someone had helped her into bed. A cup of water on the nightstand, a damp cloth gently wiping her face. She hadn't remembered it then, but now she realized it had been Ava, and Ava hadn't said a word. Just like all those other times. The rides to school when the driver was late. The forged signatures on permission slips. The quiet defense when Damien or Victor snapped too loudly, too cruelly, and Ava simply absorbed the blow with silence. Damien, meanwhile, sat in the smoking lounge of his penthouse, drink untouched, replaying a different memory. He was 17. Their father had just publicly humiliated him at a board meeting, calling him, quote, too soft to lead. Damien had locked himself in his room for hours. Later that night, a thin folder had appeared under his door, handwritten notes on the meeting, every financial figure he'd missed, with explanations so simple they bordered on brilliance. He'd assumed it was a gesture from one of the assistants. But now, he knew better. It had been Ava. She'd always been there, in the background, never demanding credit, never even asking to be seen. But she was always present, taking it in, processing, learning. And now? Every moment they'd overlooked her was a knife they'd left in her hand. Eleanor found herself standing in front of the family portrait that hung above the fireplace in the east drawing room. Painted 10 years ago, it showed them at their most polished. Victor proud and statuesque in a navy suit, Damien sharp-eyed and ambitious, Tessa radiant in ivory silk. And Ava, centered yet fading, her smile soft, almost apologetic, her eyes distant. Eleanor had insisted on her inclusion at the time, if only for the sake of appearance. Dress her in something neutral, she had told the artist. Something that won't clash. Eleanor blinked at the portrait now, studying it like a crime scene. Neutral, unclashing. Forgettable. No wonder Ava had vanished so completely. They'd raised her to be invisible, then blamed her for not being more. But it wasn't just what they'd missed. It was what they had allowed themselves to miss. Flashbacks crashed down like waves. Ava sitting silently in the back seat while Victor raged about Damien's public slip-up. Ava lingering in the kitchen doorway as Eleanor wept over Victor's latest affair. Ava folding Tessa's laundry during finals, smoothing out the silk blouses no one remembered her borrowing. She had been their confidant, their servant, their ghost. And now? She was their reckoning. Victor, still rattled from the discovery of her archive, held a family meeting, if only to project control. But the moment they gathered in the formal library, the illusion fractured. Tessa refused to sit near Damien. Damien refused to speak unless directly addressed. Eleanor appeared composed, but barely acknowledged anyone. No one mentioned Ava. They didn't have to. Her absence loomed larger than any of them. Finally, Victor cleared his throat. "She's manipulating us," he said. "We need to stay united." But no one responded. Because the truth was, Ava hadn't changed them. She had simply revealed them. The dysfunction had always been there. She had just stripped away the excuses. And now, every whispered lie, every cruel joke, every deliberate dismissal, they all echoed in the silence Ava left behind. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't raged. She had simply disappeared and let the truth take her place, a truth they could no longer run from. The walls of the Morgan estate seemed to hum with unease in the final days before the gala. What was once a palace of marble and silence had become a battleground, a glittering cage for a family devouring itself from the inside out. The second wave of Ava's letters had done what no scandal, no business deal gone wrong, and no betrayal ever had. It had turned them all against each other. Damien was the first to crack. The offshore account Ava exposed had triggered a quiet investigation by the company's board. Whispers of embezzlement and misuse of funds trickled through the executive ranks like poison. His wife, Clarissa, hadn't spoken to him in days, not since she received her own envelope. In it, Ava had enclosed a photograph of Damien in a hotel bar, hand on the thigh of a woman who wasn't Clarissa. No timestamp, no date, just the image. Suggestive enough, dangerous enough. Clarissa packed a bag and left the next morning. Now, Damien prowled the house like a lion with a splinter in its paw. He was angry, but mostly he was scared. In the drawing room, he found Tessa curled over her laptop, weeping silently. Her fiancé had called off the engagement after the scholarship leak went public. Donors were pulling their support. Her spot at the graduate program she'd been bragging about for months? Suspended pending review. She didn't even bother looking up when Damien entered. "You think this is funny?" he snapped. "You always resented me. Don't pretend you didn't have something to do with that account leak." Tessa gave a bitter laugh. "You really think I have the time or the intelligence to hack your accounts? You're as arrogant as ever. And you're still a spoiled brat who coasted through life because mom knew how to fake a sob story," they were shouting now. Neither noticed Eleanor standing in the hall, listening. Neither noticed Victor, pacing his study, fists clenched at his sides. The house had become a minefield. Everyone watched each other too closely. Every sideways glance was suspicion. Every silence was a strategy. Eleanor, who had once ruled the household like a queen behind a veil, now found herself floundering. Her publicist had reached out with questions about a potentially damaging photograph Ava had leaked to a tabloid editor. It hadn't hit the press yet, but Eleanor knew exactly which one they meant. Her kissing the married senator at a charity ball 10 years ago. That secret was old, forgotten, buried, but Ava had kept it. Preserved it, like a relic. "She's trying to destroy us," Eleanor whispered to Victor that night, pacing their bedroom. Victor sat motionless, staring out the window. "No, she's just letting us destroy ourselves." It was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks. Because the truth was, Victor's empire, the Morgan legacy, was cracking at its foundation. Board members were calling for an emergency meeting. Rumors of fraud, favoritism, and nepotism had leaked to the press. The gala was now as much a public relations war as a celebration, and worst of all, no one could stop it. Every time they tried to take control of the narrative, another secret surfaced, another ally turned cold, another thread unraveled. Tessa accused Damien of planting rumors about her failed engagement. Damien retaliated by leaking a confidential family email chain to the press, spinning a new narrative. Ava had been unstable. A threat, a disturbed daughter acting out. But the public didn't buy it. Too many letters, too much truth, too many wounds Ava had simply revealed, not invented, and somewhere beneath it all, they each began to ask themselves a quiet, terrible question. What if Ava was right? What if they had truly pushed her away, crushed her spirit, erased her presence, until the only way she could exist again was by becoming their undoing? The eve of the gala arrived, and with it, a heavy silence. None of them spoke over dinner. The table, usually set for show, not warmth, felt like a funeral altar. Crystal goblets, silver forks, beautiful, cold, and sterile. Tessa picked at her salad. Damien downed his wine. Eleanor stared at her reflection in a spoon, as if trying to find the woman she used to be. Victor finally broke the silence. Tomorrow, we smile. We toast. We hold our heads high. The world doesn't need to see the blood under our fingernails. But no one nodded. No one agreed, because deep down, they knew. The blood was no longer under their fingernails. It was on their hands. And the woman who put it there had never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She had given them every tool they needed to destroy themselves, and they had done the rest. The Morgan family arrived at the gala like a well-dressed firing squad. Victor led the way, tailored in a midnight blue tuxedo that masked none of the exhaustion in his eyes. Beside him, Eleanor moved like a porcelain statue, flawless, poised, and fragile enough to shatter with a single blow. Damien and Tessa flanked them, silent and stiff. The once vaunted Morgan siblings, now little more than actors in a crumbling production. The ballroom at the Langston Grand was bathed in gold, glittering chandeliers casting soft light over marble floors and towering floral displays. A full orchestra played a classical suite from the balcony above, and the city's elite sipped champagne and murmured admiration. But beneath the polish, something curdled in the air. Whispers trailed behind every Morgan. Guests smiled too widely, eyes lingering too long. No one said Ava's name, but it hung in the air like smoke, acrid and unavoidable. Victor tried to push forward, determined to salvage the evening. "This is legacy," he muttered under his breath, straightening his cufflinks as they made their way to the main stage. "One night. That's all we have to survive." The MC took the podium, delivering a glowing introduction of Victor Morgan, business icon, philanthropist, patriarch. Polite applause followed. Cameras flashed. The orchestra shifted to a soft, triumphant swell. Victor stepped up to the microphone, hands gripping the podium like a lifeline. "Tonight is not about the past," he began, "but about the future, about what we build for the next generation, about the strength of family." The projector behind him clicked, then flickered, then froze. A murmur rippled through the room. The music stopped. The screen turned black. Victor turned slightly, confused. Then the image sharpened, an empty chair in a white room, and then, from off-screen, someone stepped into frame. Ava. Older now. Stronger. Her posture was confident, chin high, hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She wore no makeup, no jewelry. Just a simple black blouse, eyes fixed directly on the camera. Ava Morgan. Whole, alive, and undeniably in control. "Hello, everyone," she said, her voice calm and clear, echoing through the massive room. "If you're watching this, I'm guessing my letters have made an impression." Gasps scattered like dropped champagne glasses. Victor stepped back from the podium. Eleanor clutched the edge of the stage. Tessa's mouth fell open. Damien froze, knuckles white against the back of a chair. "I didn't want to be here tonight," Ava continued, eyes flicking across the camera like she could see each of them. "But I couldn't let this celebration go unchallenged. You're not here to honor legacy, you're here to bury truth. So I thought I'd help you dig." She turned slightly in her chair, now speaking as if she were reading directly from her soul. "You called me the quiet one, the soft one. You treated me like background noise. But I was always watching, listening, remembering." A series of photos flickered onto the screen. Ava at age 10, standing just outside a family dinner photo, cropped at the edge. Then at 17, sweeping the hallway while the rest of the family laughed in the background. Over and over, images of her being present but ignored. "You told me I wasn't strong enough to carry the Morgan name. You told me silence was grace, obedience was love, invisibility was loyalty. But all you taught me was how to disappear." She looked straight into the camera now. I didn't leave because I was weak. I left because I was finally strong enough to stop playing the part you wrote for me." Gasps turned to stunned silence. And then came the final blow. Ava leaned forward, voice low, deliberate. "Oh, and Victor, I found the other will. The one you destroyed when it named me as the majority heir. The one signed by grandfather before his stroke. You forged a new one, didn't you? You always said power belonged to those who had the courage to take it. Well, I took it back." A legal document flashed onto the screen, highlighted, authenticated. A final nail in the Morgan dynasty's coffin. In that instant, Victor's legacy unraveled before hundreds of eyes. The crowd erupted. Phones came out. Reporters moved forward like wolves. Victor turned to the screen, his face pale. Eleanor sank onto a nearby chair. Tessa and Damien looked as though the ground beneath them had vanished. Ava smiled softly. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." The screen cut to black. The morning after the gala broke over the city like a slow, gray wave. Muted skies, heavy clouds, the kind of silence that feels like the air is holding its breath. But the Morgan name was not so lucky. By dawn, every major news outlet had picked up Ava's video. It was everywhere, broadcast on cable networks, shared across social media, dissected on talk shows, and whispered about behind luxury doors. The footage of Ava calmly tearing apart her family's image with poise and precision was being hailed as one of the most masterful takedowns of a legacy family in recent memory. Victor Morgan's face, caught in a frozen expression of horror, became the image on every front page. The fallout was immediate. The Morgan Group's stocks plummeted by nearly 20% in a single trading session. The board of directors convened in an emergency meeting without Victor. He was quietly asked to step down. By noon, an interim CEO was named. Corporate sponsors fled. Charities returned donations. And worst of all, clients began to publicly distance themselves from the brand that had once stood for integrity and excellence. The empire Victor had spent a lifetime constructing had been hollowed out in a single night. And Ava? She was nowhere to be found. The family scoured every possible lead. Victor tried to access the family trust, only to find that Ava's claim had been legally validated. The old will, once thought destroyed, had been retrieved and authenticated by a legal team Ava had secured long before the first letter ever reached their doors. A quiet court battle had been unfolding behind the scenes for months. She hadn't just exposed them, she had outmaneuvered them. Tessa retreated to the family's summer house in the Hamptons, avoiding press and nursing what remained of her broken engagement in academic disgrace. Damien's accounts were frozen, pending investigation, and Clarissa officially filed for divorce. Eleanor stayed in her room for days, refusing calls, mirrors, or daylight. They weren't a family anymore. They were survivors. Barely. 3 days after the gala, the groundskeeper at the Morgan estate found something peculiar. On the back patio, just beneath the garden trellis where Ava used to read as a child, a single envelope rested, sealed in wax, her name etched into the paper with the same unmistakable bold ink. No one had seen her deliver it, no cameras caught her, no staff reported movement. It was simply there. Victor was the one who opened it, hands trembling. Inside was a single page. One line. "I never needed revenge. I just needed you to finally see yourselves." He read it once, then twice. And then, for the first time in decades, Victor Morgan wept. Not in rage. Not in pride. But in something quieter. Something raw. Because that was the most painful part of all. Ava had never screamed. She hadn't fought like they expected. With chaos and cruelty, she had shown them a mirror. She had let them be themselves, and the destruction was self-inflicted. That afternoon, a curious new listing went up in the city's real estate registry. A modest brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, purchased in full by an anonymous buyer using a newly registered LLC. No photos, no fanfare. But tucked within a cafe down the block, a woman sat alone, watching the street through the window. Black coffee. Open notebook. A new name whispered by the barista. A slight smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she jotted down a sentence, then crossed it out and tried again. Ava Morgan had left the stage. But not in shame. She had rewritten the story. And this time, she was the author. The Morgan family's downfall wasn't her ending, it was her prologue.